Another one is derived data. So let's say we have this timestamp on our server for one of our articles, and that's what's stored in the database. And that's sort of the original source of truth, right? This is data that lives on the server, and if anybody disagrees with the server, they're wrong. The server is right. That's a general trend with client-server interactions. Usually, if the server thinks one thing and the client thinks a different thing, generally speaking, the server is going to win. So if you're going to have to pick one source of truth, it's usually best to assume the server is correct. So this is coming back from the server. It's coming across the wire in ISO 8601 string format. It's a string. It's going to come across in some JSON blob, and we're going to decode that into a time.posix. And from there, we're going to translate that. We're going to render it to the end user as a nicely formatted human-readable string in the client. And then finally, we're going to put that string in some HTML, and we're going to see something like this. So all of this is derived data. We have one source of truth at the root here, which is the database timestamp, and everything else is derived from that. This ISO 8601 string can be derived from having this. Given that, we can derive this. Given that, we derive this. And given that, we derive this. So there's really no motivation for an example like this for us to have multiple sources of truth for this. We're just saying, yeah, database is the source of truth, and everybody else is just saying, tell me a thing that came from the database, and I will translate it into one additional step, or translate it one step further. So as far as like where these things actually live, the database timestamp itself is hidden from the client. The first thing that we actually see is this decoded ISO 8601 string coming across the wire in the browser. Then we take that, we convert it to time.posix from the HTTP request, we store it in the model, and then we calculate that string in the view, that nicely formatted human-readable string that says May 5th, 2018, or whatever it was. And then, of course, the HTML message is also going to be calculated in the view. Now here we have an example of derived data, but we actually do, unfortunately, regrettably, end up with multiple sources of truth anyway. So here, when we're storing this in the model, this is now a client cache of something where the source of truth is the database. And because we're caching it, cache invalidation is a well-known hard problem in computer science, this can get out of date. Now in the case of a database timestamp, it really shouldn't be changing if it's an actual timestamp of like when the post was created. But if it's a timestamp of when the post was most recently edited, that could actually change on the database, and now our cached version is out of date. Unless we have some sort of WebSocket set up to live update every single time the database changes, we're probably just stale. Like the user's looking at this timestamp on the screen and it's just wrong. If you want to know the ultimate source of truth for what that timestamp is, it's on the database and it's a different value than the one we've got. So again, we have ended up with multiple sources of truth. They are competing. We're rendering the one from the client cache, but actually the one that we want to trust is the one on the database, which we don't have access to. So we actually end up caching a lot of things in the model. In general, anytime something comes in from an HTTP request, we're probably caching it in the view. This is just a reality of doing client-side development. I mean, the reason we cache things is for performance. Imagine if every single time you wanted to render, first you had to go to the server with an HTTP request, get everything back, and then render based on that. It would be incredibly slow, unusably slow. So of course we're going to cache things. But we have to be aware that when we are caching things, we have to deal with cache invalidation, which means some of the time we're potentially going to be wrong. This is sort of an accepted cost of doing business in web development or in any kind of client development, but it is something that's important to be aware of. This can be a source of bugs. Here we have some intermediate representations of this derived data. This is a lot less error prone. Like if we're saying, okay, we accept the model as the source of truth that we're going to render from, which in an Elm application sort of goes without saying, then each of these can be derived from those. And as we saw on the previous slide, we can just put those in the view function, and then they're sort of transient. They are intermediate representations on the way to the final representation that we want, which is the actual DOM nodes on the screen. So this string, which is derived from the model, and this HTML, which is derived from the string, are both intermediate representations on the way to the final form. And it's important that we don't store those intermediate representations as competing sources of truth in our model, unless we really, really have to. The reason we might have to is, again, performance. If for some reason this operation here, where we're calculating the intermediate representation, is really expensive and it's slowing everything down, then yeah, maybe we have to cache that in the model too, separately from the original source of truth that it comes from. But then at that point, we're a cache of the original source of truth, which is the database timestamp. And the more times we do that, the more competing sources of truth we have, the more potential for bugs we have. So the moral of the story is, number one, we're probably stuck with just having that client-side cache of the model and the fact that it is potentially out of date with the underlying server. That's something we're just going to have to live with for performance reasons. But we don't need to make it worse than that unless we actually have another performance problem. By default, if you have the option of rendering something in the view and then discarding it afterwards rather than recording it in the model, always do that. If it's derived data and it's something that comes from the model and nothing else, great. Put it in the view and don't have it be anywhere else. So if you're ever wondering, hey, where should this logic go? If the answer could be in the view, start with that. And only if you have a performance problem should you move it to update and then store the result in the model.